delivering mission-ready solutions, AI-powered, software-defined, and commercial-first. Combining deep mission experience with commercial partnerships, Booz Allen is defining a new defense industrial base. A network that crosses traditional boundaries to scale non-traditional technologies and brings our best tech to the hands of the warfighter faster, effectively delivering technology for today and tomorrow. Booz Allen, accelerating outcomes for today's warfighters.
Hello, and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Seraphin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. On today's episode, we're going to think about the STEM workforce in the Pentagon and in the U.S. government as a whole, and think about their credentials, their education, their experience, and how it relates to the things that they do for a living, which is manage and buy and regulate some very complex technologies, ranging from biotechnology to quantum computing to hypersonics. To help us think about this, we're joined by Dr. Jae Yu, who actually is a former colleague of those of us at the National Defense Industrial Association, with a strong background actually in looking at workforce issues broadly in the military and doing some deep data analysis. And so Jay joined us to do a study on these kinds of issues, which we are about to release. And today we have the opportunity to kind of talk through some of those results. So Jay, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Arun. It's good to see you again. Really excited to do the podcast and really dive deep into this subject.
So Jay, we didn't just stumble across you at the office, just like at the water cooler or something. You actually have a legitimate background in this stuff. So for the audience, tell us about some of your background and how you got into doing data analysis on these complex policy issues.
Sure. I started off my career as an Army officer and did a good grace from the Army. They sent me to school. So as an infantry officer, I got sent to get my PhD in public policy and public administration, where I got to teach some of that at West Point as well. Some of my focuses at the time was workforce composition, particularly pertaining to the military, on recruitment, promotion, and retention. There was a lot of good information that I gained from that, but I also formed deep passion to go even further. I expanded my research to hybrid network organizations and advocacies into state and local governments, and it still brought me back into doing more complex, methodologies like mixed methods, using multivariate regressions or structural equation modeling to get to some fine insights that we had the data for, but never really pushed it through any type of academic rigor. And it kind of brought me to, the discussions I had with Arun and this opportunity to kind of look at some of the data sets from Leadership Connect. And from that, I think, the audience will have a very interesting perspective of hopefully from the discussion we'll have today.
Yeah, so let's start with that partnership with Leadership Connect. So Leadership Connect is a member of NDIA and a great sponsor of some of the work we've done here, and they provide a whole bunch of services to defense industry and to the government, including looking at data on acquisition, including looking at data on the workforce, both in industry and in the government. So you partnered with Leadership Connect to build a data set. What sort of questions were you looking at hoping to answer? And then what kind of information did you try to build with Leadership Connect?
Yes. So with Leadership Connect, I thought it was a pretty interesting platform in the sense that it's like the LinkedIn for government. And I thought there must be some interesting insight that could be gained from that. And then when I had the opportunity to kind of gain access to that data, I wanted to see what I could gain from it. And from that, I was motivated in some ways just to understand the technical expertise, particularly in STEM fields, and how that maps into the leadership within, Department of War. And then with that, I had an assumption, maybe a hypothesis or a question, like there's a growing national security emphasis for STEM and technical leadership, but I haven't really seen the mechanical motions or the pathway to get to that. So it made me kind of make the assumption at the time that we lack empirical data on who actually hold these roles, or if that's even true. Like if that, you know, that motivation actually holds water. And then from that, I had access to this data from Leadership Connect to potentially bridge the gap between the discourses about the STEM leadership and actual profiles. And going back to what I was able to gain from that, Leadership Connect had a very robust data set of, not just the name, the office, the roles, work experience, but also like the education and then, longitudinal work history. And from that, we thought we could get some interesting perspectives when you push it through, multivariate regression, or just look at it holistically. Like how does this actually pan out? What does it kind of look like? So from that data set of sample count of like 2,000 or so, we thought we got some interesting illuminations from this interaction with Leadership Connect.
Yeah, the high level questions are ones that, we are always struggle with. At one level, when I think about the STEM workforce at the Department of War, you think about the kinds of things they do. They do everything from very operational cybersecurity operational missions or chem bio defense operational missions to things like being smart buyers or regulators of very complex industries like the aerospace industry, and in new fields like biotechnology or artificial intelligence. And buying things in those fields is complicated. Regulating things in those fields is very complicated. They do things like manage research laboratories or agencies like, DARPA and places like that. And these are all STEM employees in the government doing those things. And I haven't even said they actually do science, right? They work at laboratories. They work at test ranges. And so there's a set of people thinking about, do we have enough in that STEM workforce to include things like manufacturing, right? What you're asking is a slightly different question is, what is the background of these actual people? Because I think it's fair to ask, like, do we know objectively what the right background is? And I think that's kind of some of the stuff you got into, is that it's really interesting to see these backgrounds. We don't know whether it's right or wrong what these backgrounds are, but you found some interesting information about what those educational and experiential backgrounds are. What I was fascinated by was the Leadership Connect database as well, which is constantly growing and evolving because that's their business, right? And so people who want access to figuring out who's doing what in these various organizations, that's a great place to go to get that kind of information.
No, absolutely. And I think we truly benefit by having something like Leadership Connect where we can access and kind of see. It also has done a lot to just give more visibility into certain offices, and then having these personas and being able to connect per se with them to address certain of the issues. But really, again, now we have a source to aggregate some of this and then see what we gain out of that. And perhaps I'm going ahead of myself, but what I found from at least the data set I looked at in 2023, 41% of individuals in the senior STEM roles hold STEM degrees. Like, take it for what you will. That's just a fact. Well, I'm not saying it's a huge issue, like to what, Arun stated. It takes more to be able to navigate the complexities of the Pentagon, from, the acquisition funding and then the research to manage all that. But it just brings up the question, are we poised for the next 10 years or so as technology is advancing, that maybe the answer is, wouldn't we want someone with those soft skills and the technical background? That would be the most ideal. So this is just to showcase a point in time, what we have representing, there are leaders representing the STEM field right now in DoD. So.
Yeah, and this is a complex question. So if you say to me, 41% is the number you use, so that's less than half of senior STEM roles are held by people with formal STEM degrees. Some people may say that's a tragedy and a travesty. Other people may say, no, that's exactly right? These are leadership senior roles. I would rather have people remember they're part of the Department of War and they have your operational Army kind of background, or no, this is a complex world. A lot of things are happening in the private sector. A lot of things are going on with venture capital. I want people with business and management backgrounds, not necessarily equation solvers or guys like me who learned how to align lasers for a living, right? So, yeah, you're, I think, just putting out this question, but do you have any sense of what you think it means that 41% is that is is there a way to get at whether that's good or bad?
I I think it's just what we have going on, to your point, is just to reflect like what the Department of War is just prioritizing. As you can see from their promotion, it's just behavioral. And if you aggregate that, what are they kind kind of lean towards, which is institutional knowledge, budget fluency, and leadership networks are what are the character traits, which are all kind of subjective, that gets risen up. And quite frankly, to your point again, yeah, those are more important to be able to do that, to be able to get the priorities through, get the capability into the hands of the war fighters, and being able to look at a very high level view into national security rather than the granulars. However, I want to caveat though, I am unsure if that is enough for the next warfare or the next, World War III or whatnot. I think this should be in some ways a wake-up call that we shouldn't be complacent. Yeah, sure, it worked well in a peacetime environment or, small scale operations like in Afghanistan and so forth. But large scale and multi-domain, I think we do need more talent into the field. And I think a lot will agree that the government will benefit by bringing more hybrid leaders that have both the technical and soft skills to lead us in the next age.
So one of the things along these lines that you found, I noticed, was you had very precise numbers here. Roughly 27% of the individuals you looked at had prior professional STEM workforce experience before they got into these senior leader positions. So 27%, some might argue that's low as well, right? And so does that tell you anything about how people are promoted or hired into these positions?
Yes, and here's where I think taking a little bit of a hybrid approach into the research really gives us the good quality, rich data. Like the numbers would just tell you one thing, but then when you start asking about, like when we started doing some of the interviews with some of these senior leaders, it's the networking effects or it's the human interactions of sorts that actually weighed more heavily. To say like how they got into the GS-15 above positions, it's usually like, oh, they knew me. My previous boss worked at this office and they thought I would be a good role for it. And that weighed more heavily than just looking at someone's resume or background. This isn't necessarily bad, like I said. It just underscores the importance of pairing technical teams with the experienced operators, not substituting one for the other. But it's also just to highlight something I don't think is really mentioned, but we know it's happening. It's an underlying feature of how things are worked in the Pentagon or Department of War, is that it is a people business, it's people endeavors, and that a lot of these networking effects are truly what is the underpinning or the emphasis to get into folks into these complex roles where you can't just have a binary of like someone having the education to fill it. It does require level of experience, panache, a little bit of that experience of leading large organizations that you just can't get out of a standard resume. So, you got to kind of go through the ringer and then have like people to vouch for you to fill those positions. And that's why we've succeeded thus far.
Yeah, what you're talking about then is having a promotion and hiring process, which should certainly value your STEM education and experience, but not overemphasize it in that process, because you may just be really good and you may have incredible people skills or knowledge of the business environment that you're bringing into the position, And you could have carried that with you, whether you were managing a group doing high energy physics or high energy lasers, or or AI or bio, right? And certainly, if you came from a more military operational background and just understood how to best transition technologies, as opposed to maybe the details of how the technology worked, that could have also been beneficial. But the challenge is that you're talking about a very nuanced promotion and hiring process. Those are really hard to turn into something that scales across something the size of the Department of War. And there's certainly something that's very difficult to make into a bureaucratic, repeatable process that's viewed as regular, fair, observable, and comfortable for both the workforce and the management and the oversight, right? So, what you're describing here is is good managerial organizational behavior that may not come out in any numbers. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. And if we were to even change and then go and then talk about this at scale, it is more to the core of the philosophical and cultural overhaul to get to the means. But again, I think what we lacked in just the understanding the workforce for the government and then, Department of War, it's a starting point. Where are we at? Like, what is the background? Like, those, I want to keep the questions really simple and then see, like, if we want to action on it. Because here's the other conversations I'm getting. Like, we are not getting enough technical people into it, or we're not this, or we're lacking chips, folks that understand this side of the industry. Well, to get to that change, it needs to start from the top of the funnel, and then has to impact it all the way down to the bottom. And it needs to start somewhere. So I'm hoping at least this just starts the conversations on like where to go. But if we want to change it, you have to go across the different echelons to get to the means to make those changes. It's not going to happen just because one research says so and one person believes with conviction. It needs to be, like, again, philosophical, cultural overhaul to get to that.
I noticed in the paper that certain fields, maybe more technical, maybe things like hypersonics or space technologies, right? They showed higher rates of prior STEM experience than other areas, some of which could be considered pretty technical, integrated sensing and cyber or biotechnology. And so it's odd. Well, what do you think explains some of those very field specific differences that you ran into? What explains it in terms of workforce dynamic or the sectors themselves, where you see in some areas higher rates of STEM experience and other areas lower rates of STEM experience?
It's going to be hard for me to categorize like just by buckets, but perhaps just picking like what you brought up, like hypersonics space as an example. And you have to do the same rigor by the eaches. You can't just bucket them all together. But for those two, for example, uh, which are deeply rooted in physics, engineering, aeronautics, which are, very demanding STEM credentials. You got to look at the historics too. Like, these are Cold War era defense R&D with long traditions of recruiting engineers and physicists. And there's this type of rigor that's existed through NASA and DARPA programs that still proliferate to this day. It still exists. So there's some cultural and historical tendencies that kind of like push that agenda along of like really honing in on the credentials for that. The other ones, again, picking those two, for example, there are clear academic and career pipelines. Like, when you come out with those type of degrees, aeronautical engineering or rocket science, those pipelines to getting those internships into NASA or those type of, government organizations are, I would say, a little more clear and more supportive, but it's more, again, vouched out. So it seems very clear in those sense. The other ones, like, I don't know, like biotech or cyber, for example, they're like treated as interdisciplinary, drawing from just policy and acquisition management backgrounds. Like, you have a little bit of that. There's a lot of other pieces you can put in together to validate your credentials for it, as long as you have some of So I think that's the type of lens you would have to look in, one from historics, cultural, and looking at the pipelines and what type of support. And that sort of kind of makes sense when you look at the numbers. Like again, hypersonics, like very STEM heavy, and then the other ones that are more interdisciplinary, less so, because it's, you got to tie it to incentives and motivations, like, to jobs or whatever. And if those disciplines aren't saying like you need this to get to here, then you're probably going to get less.
Yeah, and there's a community, especially I think these days in the software world, where they sort of are proudly talking about how many people are super successful who are college dropouts. So if you were purely looking at data, you wouldn't find those people, right? They are really good, let's say hackers, but never finished their degree, right? But they're still good at what they did. It's almost the equivalent of saying, well, can you be a technician without having all these degrees? Well, yeah, I guess you could be a technician, right? And on the policy side, my own experience is, I did lots of policy stuff and things that I claim to have some education in technology issues. I did plenty of policy things on workforce, which I had zero training in, right? I got no training in management of systems, but I wrote laws in that as well. And so, while the STEM culture seems to really poke hard at like, hey, you need a background in this to grow in STEM, there's other places in tech, in the business world, in policy, where it's almost like we'll take anyone who's good and willing to learn and willing to apply their background.
No, absolutely. And that's why, like, some of the stuff that, we're talking about in the workforce and then the mapping, the pathways it's more nuanced. You can't oversimplify it, because like it's driven by people. People are very dynamic and unpredictable, and there's all these different motivations tied to that. And to that extent, what we want to do is, like, of course, there's going to be anomalies. Like, people are like, there's going to be crazy geniuses that don't need anything, and then they could like solve the world issues. But as an aggregate, again, just interesting to point out, like, where, where the government or, Department of War saying we need to encourage more STEM or emerging technologies, but from their hiring or workforce management perspective, it's not quite aligned. And then perhaps because they kind of understand, like, maybe in some areas it doesn't matter. Again, just pointing out, like, if it's really important and you really think it's an issue, then we got to make some changes to get those numbers up.
What I liked about what you did in the paper was also follow up on the data collection and analysis that you did with Leadership Connect and honestly with other sources as well, by doing some interviews with NDIA members and other experts in the government and outside that you conducted following your data analysis. So how do you compare the what the interviewees told you about the value of that hands-on STEM experience with the data, which kind of shows that like you said earlier, the majority of these people don't have that background?
Yeah, without the conversations, I would just make the assumption like, whoa, this data makes it look really bad, like from our, earlier conversation. But what it really just did was really hone in on what everyone just knew about the importance of networking, knowing who knows who, but also validating the unquantifiables. Like, how do you even quantify leadership? I was a good leader. Like, how do you give a score for that? But yet we clearly know there's good ones and bad ones. How do we even quantify soft skills? Like, to be able to walk across the room from agency to agency to gain buy-in without being hostile, right? Like, those are things that you can't quantify, but yet it's really important. And there's a high premium for that. And we know it exists. It's just can't put numbers behind it. So what the qualitative interviews really did is from their own personal experiences or provide anecdotes about like the importance of that. How to, like, from getting to point A to point B is not a mathematical equation. It's a human endeavor that requires a lot of different modalities and skills that's kind of put together, and then how to put it packages up in a way that gets the job done. So what they really highlighted is, you know, they acknowledge that, okay, maybe like I don't have the STEM, or, or like, or they wish someone had some type of STEM credentials when, they were being led. But however, as they kind of progress, they realize it is a multifaceted, multi-bucketed, skill sets that's going to be required. However, they also did point out that there are instances that, not having those STEM backgrounds could also hurt. I think in the point of making very technical decisions on how to fund or how to regulate AI, like, you know, how do you become the arbiter? Like, yeah, you may be managing the SMEs, but if you don't have like a background to understand even what they're talking about to a certain degree, you could be making some bad decisions that have huge implications to national security. So what that really just highlighted that is in certain areas, of course, like we could take a couple of risks not having that. But in certain areas, like we may benefit from having more STEM. But the thing is, we just don't know right now. I think this question is kind of novel in the sense that we just assumed we had the right people with the right roles for whatever it is. I just try to make it kind of simple by binary. What's their background, education? Do they have, the initial job description credentials that's needed to even get to that path? And if it's not, then what were the reasons and why were they successful? I think that's the next question that we really want to get to.
So you said, you wanted to have the paper be the start of the conversation and lay some of the numbers and some of these perspectives from the interviews out in front of people. But, we can't do an ETI paper without some recommendations, and you provide some recommendations here. So one of the things I noticed is that you highlighted limitations in the actual data, right? In the publicly available data that you got to look at and other people get to look at. So what was your recommendation on data collection?
I had, again, quite a bit, but some of the data that I think we can benefit from is because, like, to be clear, I very, very much oversimplified even the question about like what even qualifies to be like STEM credentials. Like I just use education because what I had, but we know now there's certificates. There's also these work apprenticeship roles that that doesn't get logged in as an actual job experience or it doesn't go anywhere. But those are important to really like learn what's happening for, that STEM background. So I think having more robust tagging, coding of the academic background that goes more holistically, I think we could benefit, particularly the non-traditional pathways. I think demographic variables are going to be pretty big. Like, we didn't have age. I think age is very interesting, especially if you start looking at, folks born in the 2000s, like how they use social media to, promote or even navigate is going to be very different. And, we didn't go too deeply into that subset, but those that use social media versus others, like what does that really do? That needs to be filled out. This one's going to be hard to get, like social economic background and geography. That could really showcase like where are areas in the region, zip codes where, like young high school students don't have access or infrastructure or funding pathways into research centers that really could possibly hinder us. And if we understood that, probably reinvest in certain areas to kind of propagate and solve those issues, I think will be interesting. And then again, training development history wasn't captured, like mentorship, technical upskilling, or like rotational programs. I think that's also another insight on how to capture the holistic work experience and skill sets. So again, it's very aspirational what I'm asking, but if we were able to gather that, I think we can make even better and more accurate insights and recommendations on how to, either resolve or bring this issue in front of our leaders.
Another recommendation that you have is looking at upskilling and training investments and, professional development in general. So what do you recommend along those lines?
So there are a few recommendations, but I also want to, first, I want to highlight like the this awesome opportunity we have right now in this time. There's a lot of recent tech layoffs, and there's a lot of reports, particularly one from Handshake, about the rising unemployment and the disproportionality that's affecting early career professionals. So the reports say there's been a 2% increase in interest in government jobs. There's 76% of the early graduates valuing job stability. To me, this sounds like an opportunity for government where stability is the name, and and there is a pathway and giving like good purpose behind the work that they do, which is really valuable with this new generation. So, but going back to what upskilling or what development or recommendations we have, I think we need to start doing it now because given the environment, um, I think new on-ramps for new talent, I think is going to be important, like pathway programs to attract the early careerists, uh, broadening the talent pool, especially in underrepresented geographic regions with the limited access of R&D, like I was talking about, and STEM pipelines. So that's through funding, resources, provide a little more robust infrastructure, proximity to those large research bases or access to it, I think is another one to increase the pipe. Scale programs like the Defense Established program to stimulate edit research is, the correct federal R&D funding that kind of fixes some of the imbalance between states, but it's not enough. Like we definitely could really invest a little more into that area. Empowering minority-served institutions like HBCUs, TCUs, AAPISIs, like these undergrads are coming in with a lot of STEM backgrounds, and they're not really having the pathway, the connection to the connective tissue to get into these roles. They're kind of left on their own. So like,
And from a Department of War perspective, they're often U.S. citizens, right? They have the ability to get clearances.
they have some already have clearances. They're ideal candidates for national security. We could tailor fellowships to be a little more specific instead of broad. I mean, because when you're too broad, sometimes it just doesn't resonate or hit home. So when you're talking to someone, they have a deep, like, affinity towards medical logistics in the contested environment. Like, who talks about that? But some niches, it does resonate. I think we're a little too broad and hand wavy with some of our approaches, not really understanding the new up and coming workforce, how that aligns to the purpose, mentorship, network activations. It's not quite there yet. And then public-private education partnerships. I think it's more adversarial right now. Like, private wants to have the best talent and public sector wants, but I think we could benefit in both ways by having these pathways where, joint internships and mentorships and skill bridging programs which just benefit just both sides at the end instead of just, stovepiping each other from the talent. It doesn't benefit anyone at the end. And that certainly doesn't benefit the individual who's just trying to find meaningful work. So those are just seem like a big list, but those are a few that's on top of mind on what we can do to make these training investments and have a bigger impact at scale for the department. It's just looking at the right places to invest. And a few, just the ones that I've just kind of highlighted, that could be the starting point.
So it turns out that the work you did is sort of tiles in nicely with some of the other work that's going on in ETI. We've got papers coming out on things like the high skills immigration opportunities for the national security establishment, both in government and industry. We've got best practices in regulating emerging technology areas, which, like you said, if you don't have that technical background, you may not be in a best place to regulate. On the other hand, if you don't have the business background, you may also not be in the best place to regulate. And so you don't want too much of one or too much of the other. And we're doing some work in that space as well. And then we've always done work in these various pipelines and pathways that you mentioned, work with the Defense Civilian Training Corps, for example, or the minority serving institutions, or those DEP score programs through our divisions and our chapters. So it's great you're providing some of the underlying data and some of the findings that kind of tie into some of the other stuff we're doing. Okay, if you had the chance to do any kind of follow-on work, or if you could wish follow-on work on other people, what else would you like to see examined, in this space going forward?
I think what would be interesting is to which is the part two of okay, now we understand if we just look at the breakdown of who has this versus that. It's now I think we want to continue on to what we're kind of alluding towards the end. What can we do about it to increase those numbers and to do maybe A/B testing or something to kind of see what. But those are longitudinal studies, obviously, because we're talking about career progressions and whatnot. But again, you asked aspirationally, if I had that choice, if I could be the king, I would love to see what out of all these repertoires, because we can't do them all, but out of these, what could be the most valuable benefit? And I have the assumption that it is targeting the minority served institutions and then creating just more of those depth score, R&D funding pathways. I think could be a good starting point to figure out the true benefits of I would love to see the Monte Carlo of if I invested 10% more in this region versus that, or if I did it in this program versus that, what would on an aggregate, could we see the benefit into the pipeline into recruitment? And if you could do it even more longitudinally, how do we affect their promotion and retention rates? Again, long studies, lots of time, lots of money, people, I got it. But I would love to see that going towards that direction to really get to the heart of the issue and solve this problem. And to really solve the critical, complex problems of tomorrow, it's the people. We got to invest in the people and allow them to flourish and get into the right places where they can make the decisions for tomorrow. And it has to happen today and not tomorrow. So.
That's great. I'm going to give you the last word. Dr. Jae Yu has been our guest. He's the author of a new ETI study called Mapping Emerging Technology Roles, Analysis of STEM Qualifications, which is available soon on the ETI NDIA website. Jay, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for watching another episode of Emerging Tech Horizons. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of our latest content. We're available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including on YouTube. We also want to extend our appreciation to Booz Allen Hamilton for sponsoring today's episode. We encourage you to please visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series, and to get information over the next few months about our September 2026 Emerging Technologies for Defense Conference and Exhibition, which Dr. Jae Yu helped us run a couple of years ago. It's grown, Jay. It's grown since your day. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in to Emerging Tech Horizons.